"Son, are those your daddy's shoes?" Coach Reggie Mallard's laugh cracked across the Tatum County High School track like a starter's pistol, and the 17 returning varsity boys clustered around him, laughed with him, because that was how things worked on Coach Mallard's team. Darius Coleman, 15 years old, 6'1" and 143 pounds, soaking wet, stood at the edge of the track in a pair of gray Nikes, 2 sizes too big, and a pair of basketball shorts that hung past his knees. He had taken the 4:47 p.m. bus from his grandmother's house in Hatcher, Georgia, transferred once, and walked the final half mile to make the 5:30 p.m. tryout. His mother had not been able to leave work to drive him. He had not eaten since lunch. He held a folded permission slip in his right hand. He did not laugh with the other boys. He did not look down at his shoes. He looked instead directly at Coach Mallard with an expression that the assistant coach standing 5 feet behind Mallard would later describe in a sworn statement to the State Athletic Commission as the calmest face I have ever seen on a 15-year-old child. Coach Mallard, still smiling, gestured toward the starting line of the 400-meter oval painted in faded red on the asphalt. He told the boy he could go ahead and run a warm-up qualifier so they could see if he could handle real training. He told him to run the 400 meters. He told him not to be embarrassed if he had to stop and walk halfway through. He winked at his returning varsity. He clicked his stopwatch. 46 seconds and 42 hundredths later, the stopwatch slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the asphalt. The Georgia high school state record in the 400-meter dash, set in 1984 by a runner who would go on to win 2 NCAA championships and represent the United States at the Seoul Olympics, had stood for 40 years. Darius Coleman, in 2 sizes too big Nikes and basketball shorts, had just broken it by 49 hundredths of a second, and he had done it on his first lap of the day. 6 months earlier, Darius Coleman had been sitting in the back of a Toyota Camry on Interstate 75, watching the Atlanta skyline disappear behind him through the rear windshield. His mother Latrice was driving. His grandmother Bernadine was in the passenger seat with her hands folded in her lap. Behind them, in a small U-Haul trailer, was everything the Coleman family still owned after 8 months of medical bills, funeral costs, and the slow, methodical financial annihilation that follows the death of a self-employed black man without adequate life insurance. Darius's father, Marcus Coleman, had been 41 years old when he collapsed on the floor of the small barbershop he had owned in southwest Atlanta. The autopsy report had used the words undiagnosed hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. His mother had used the words, "He never went to a doctor because he was always taking care of us." Marcus had been a runner. Himself in high school, nothing serious, nothing recruited, but fast enough to win district twice at Mays High in the late 1990s. He had been the one who taught Darius to run. He had taken him to Piedmont Park every Saturday morning since Darius was 5 years old. He had timed him with the stopwatch on his phone. He had said, more than once, in the casual voice of a father who knew exactly what he was looking at, "Son, you are something else." Latrice Coleman had moved her son and herself into her mother's small 2-bedroom ranch house in Hatcher because the alternative was losing the apartment in Atlanta. Hatcher was a town of 3,847 people in rural northeast Georgia, 76% white. The high school had 273 students total. Coach Reggie Mallard had been the head coach of the Tatum County track program for 31 years. He had inherited the position from his uncle, who had held it for 19. He drove an F250 with a small Confederate flag decal on the back window that the principal had asked him 3 different times over the decades to please remove. He had always agreed. He had never removed it. In 31 years, Coach Mallard had produced exactly 1 individual state champion. Her name was Sarah Crenshaw. She had won the 1,600 meters in 2003. She had been white, blonde, the daughter of a local doctor, and she had also, Coach Mallard liked to remind people, worked harder than any athlete he had ever coached. He brought her up at Booster Club dinners as evidence that his program was a meritocracy that rewarded discipline and the right kind of character. None of the 17 black athletes who had passed through his program over the previous 3 decades had ever been mentioned by name at a Booster Club dinner. 2 of them had quit the team within their first season, citing what they described, in conversations with their parents that never reached Coach Mallard, as an environment. One of them, a sprinter named Tyrone Wilkes, in 2011, had finished third at the regional 200-meter qualifier as a sophomore and had been quietly cut from the team the following spring. The assistant coach at the time, a man named Dennis Pollard, had started keeping a private notebook in his desk drawer that year with the names and times of every athlete Coach Mallard had cut, dismissed, or quietly pushed out. Dennis Pollard was now in his 15th year as Coach Mallard's assistant. The notebook had grown to 47 pages. Darius Coleman had run throughout his 3 years in middle school in Atlanta on a small youth track club called the Atlanta Striders. His coach there had been a man named Coach Mike Davies, a former Georgia Tech sprinter who ran the club as a side project around his job as a UPS regional manager. Coach Davies had timed Darius in the 400 meters in 8th grade at 48.21. He had not, at the time, told Darius what that number meant. He had told the boy's father instead. The high school state record for sophomores in Georgia, public and private schools combined, was 48.40. Darius had run faster than that as a 13-year-old 8th grader. Coach Davies had told Marcus they needed to be smart, not push too hard, not burn the kid out. Marcus had nodded. He had said, "Coach, I just want him to have what I didn't have." 3 weeks later, Marcus had collapsed in his barbershop and died. Darius had not run competitively in the 8 months between his father's death and the move to Hatcher. He had run alone, mostly at night, on the empty sidewalks of his Atlanta neighborhood, in shoes he had outgrown and that his mother had not had money to replace. He had run because running was the one thing he knew how to do that made the sound in his head quieter. He had run on most nights for 40 or 50 minutes without stopping. By the time his mother told him they were moving to Hatcher, his resting heart rate was 42 beats per minute, and he had grown 3.5 inches in the previous year. He had also, in the long months of grief, developed an economy of motion that Coach Davies, if he had seen Darius run that spring, would have recognized as the kind of stride no 15-year-old should be able to produce. Darius did not know any of this. He only knew that running was the thing he and his father had done together, and that running was the thing he still had. He had decided to try out for the Tatum County track team in early March, 2 weeks into his enrollment at the high school. He had told his mother. His mother had cried for 15 minutes and then said yes. His grandmother Bernadine had given him $40 to buy a pair of running shoes at the Walmart in Cornelia. The cheapest pair in his size had been $48. He had bought a pair 2 sizes too big for $36 instead, planning to wear thick socks. He had not told his mother or his grandmother that the shoes were the wrong size. He had not told them either that he had been waking up at 4:30 a.m. every morning for 2 weeks to run 6 miles on the empty country roads around Hatcher before the school bus came, because he wanted to be ready. He had not told them what ready meant. He had not been entirely sure himself. On the afternoon of the tryout, Coach Mallard was standing at the 50-yard line of the football field that bisected the inside of the track when he saw Darius walking toward him. He took in the kid in a single glance. Tall, skinny, black, new face, basketball shorts. Wrong shoes. He had seen this kid 1,000 times in his career. Or, more precisely, he had seen what he assumed was this kid. He had assumed the way coaches like Reggie Mallard had been assuming for 40 years, that what walked up to his track was a body, not an athlete. That the body would do what bodies like that always did. Show up, fool around for a week, miss practice, get cut. The variation was minor. The script was familiar. Coach Mallard knew his lines. He gathered his returning varsity around him. He nodded toward Darius as the boy approached. He raised his voice slightly so that the boy could hear him. He made his joke about the shoes. The varsity laughed. Coach Mallard told Darius to go ahead and warm up, which Darius did, silently jogging 2 slow laps around the outside of the track while the returning varsity ran their workout in the inside lanes. After the warm-up, Coach Mallard gestured toward the starting line of the 400. He told Darius, with the same paternal smirk he had used on 3 decades of kids he was about to dismiss, that they were going to see what he had. He told him to run the 400 meters at full speed. He told him not to worry about pacing. He told him not to worry about looking pretty. He told him that they just wanted to see if he could finish without stopping. He told him not to be embarrassed if he had to walk the last 100 meters. He winked at his returning varsity. He clicked his stopwatch. Darius did not respond to any of this. He walked to the starting line. He set his feet. He looked down the long red curve of the first turn. He thought for 1 second about his father sitting on the bench at Piedmont Park with a stopwatch on his phone. He thought about Marcus Coleman, 41 years old, on the floor of his own barbershop. He thought about the look on his mother's face when she had told him they were moving to Hatcher. And then he stopped thinking. He had learned, in 8 months of running alone at night, how to stop thinking. He took one slow breath. He took one fast breath. He pushed off. The first 100 meters of a 400-meter race are run at roughly 95% of an athlete's maximum speed. The third 100 meters are the meters where the race is won or lost. The fourth 100 meters, in most high school athletes, become a controlled survival. Coach Mallard had watched several thousand 400-meter races in his career. He knew from the first 30 meters of any race approximately what time the athlete was going to run. It was a kind of physics. The body told you what it could do. Darius Coleman came out of the blocks, or more precisely, out of a standing start, because no one had bothered to bring him blocks, with a stride length that did not, in any sense Coach Mallard could understand, belong to a 15-year-old child in basketball shorts. His foot turnover was inhumanly clean. His knees came up to a height the returning varsity boys had not, in their combined 73 years of competitive track experience, ever produced themselves. He cleared the first 100 meters in 10.84 seconds. Coach Mallard, watching, felt his mouth open slightly. He glanced at his stopwatch. He glanced back at the track. The kid had not slowed down. The kid was, if anything, accelerating into the backstretch. The returning varsity had stopped laughing. Dennis Pollard, the assistant coach, had taken his own stopwatch out of his pocket and clicked it about 20 meters into the race, which meant his time would be about 3 seconds short of the official time. He was watching with his mouth slightly open as well. Darius hit the 200-meter split at 21.96 seconds. This was, had anyone in the field house at Tatum County High School known it at the time, a time roughly comparable to what a top 10 NCAA Division I 400-meter runner would split at the same point in his race. Coach Mallard did not, at that moment, know this. He only knew that something was happening on his track that he had not previously believed could happen on his track. Darius came out of the second turn into the home stretch with the stride of a runner who had not yet begun to suffer. He was alone on the track. The other returning varsity, who had been doing a workout in lanes 1 and 2, had stopped running entirely. 2 of them were standing in lane 4 with their hands on their heads. The third was looking at Coach Mallard. The fourth, a senior named Tucker Hall, who had run a 51.4 quarter the previous spring and considered himself the fastest 400-meter runner in the county, had sat down on the infield grass. Darius hit the 300-meter mark in 33.41 seconds. Coach Mallard, watching the digital readout of his stopwatch tick past 33.41, felt his hand begin to shake. The Georgia State record in the 400 meters was 46.91. It had been set in 1984. The runner who had set it, a young man named Vincent "Vinny" Talbot from Decatur, had gone on to win 2 NCAA championships at LSU and to represent the United States at the 1988 Seoul Olympics. Coach Mallard had been an undergraduate at Georgia Southern in 1984 and had watched Vinny Talbot set that record on a black and white television in his dorm common room. He had never forgotten the time. 46.91. It had stood for 40 years for a reason. Darius came out of the final turn into the home stretch, and he was by every visible indication available to a coach with 31 years of experience watching 400-meter races, still accelerating. He was not surviving. He was not maintaining. He was running the back end of a 400-meter race the way no high school athlete in the state of Georgia had ever run one in Coach Mallard's lifetime. His arms moved in clean, low pumps. His chin was tucked. The basketball shorts flapped around his knees. The wrong-sized Nikes did not, somehow, seem to slow him down. He crossed the finish line. The stopwatch in Coach Mallard's hand read 46.42. Coach Mallard stared at the readout. He stared at the kid, who had decelerated through the curve past the finish line and was now jogging back toward him, with no visible signs of distress. He stared at the readout again. He glanced at Dennis Pollard. Dennis Pollard was looking down at his own stopwatch, which read 43.21 because Pollard had clicked it 20 meters into the race. Pollard did the math in his head. He looked up. He looked at Coach Mallard. He said very quietly, "Coach, that's a state record. That's a state record by half a second." Coach Mallard did not respond. His hand holding the stopwatch was shaking visibly. The stopwatch slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the asphalt. He did not bend down to pick it up. He stared at the boy jogging back toward him. The color had left his face. It had drained from his cheeks in stages. First the flush of the cold afternoon, then the natural ruddiness of his complexion, then the underlying warmth of his neck above the collar of his coach's polo. His face was the color of skim milk. He looked at Darius Coleman, who had stopped about 10 feet in front of him, and was bending over with his hands on his knees, not because he was tired, but because his father had taught him that this was the way to recover properly from a hard effort. "Son," Coach Mallard finally said. His voice did not sound like his own. "Son, what's your name?" "Darius, do you know what you just ran?" He shook his head. 46.42, 46.42, in a tryout. Coach Mallard's voice broke. He stopped. He cleared his throat. "Where have you been running? Who's your coach?" Darius straightened up. He thought about Coach Mike Davies, who he had not seen in 8 months. He thought about Piedmont Park on Saturday mornings. He thought about a phone stopwatch in his father's hand. "My dad, sir." "Your dad? Where is he?" "My dad died, sir, 8 months ago. We moved here to live with my grandmother." It came apart. The lines around his eyes deepened. His mouth pulled down at the corners. He did not cry. He did not, in any sense Darius could see, lose his composure. But Dennis Pollard, who had been watching Coach Mallard's face for 15 years, saw something pass behind the coach's eyes that he had never seen there before. It was not exactly remorse. It was closer to the recognition that a man can spend 31 years of his life being absolutely confident he knew what he was looking at, and be absolutely wrong, and have it proven to him in 46 seconds and 42 hundredths on a Tuesday afternoon in March by a 15-year-old child whose shoes did not fit. Coach Mallard bent down. He picked up the stopwatch. He looked at the readout again. He looked at Darius. "Son, I owe you an apology." The returning varsity standing on the infield did not breathe. Dennis Pollard did not breathe. Coach Mallard had never apologized to an athlete in the 31 years Dennis Pollard had known him. He had not apologized when he had cut Tyrone Wilkes in 2011. He had not apologized in 1997 when a black freshman named Kendrick Booth had quit the team after a comment Mallard had made about his hair. He had not apologized 1 minute and 12 seconds ago when he had laughed at this boy's shoes. "Darius, I made a joke about your shoes when you walked up. That was wrong of me. I was wrong. I want to apologize to you for that, and I want to apologize in front of these boys because they should hear it. I'm sorry, son. I was wrong about you. I have been wrong about a lot of things, and I am sorry." Darius looked at him. He nodded once. He said, "Thank you, sir." Coach Mallard turned to Dennis Pollard. He said, in a voice that had grown very steady, "Dennis, I'd like you to call the State Athletic Association first thing tomorrow morning. I want to know the procedure for getting this time officially ratified and for getting Mr. Coleman seeded into the state qualifier and the right meets between now and the end of the season." Dennis Pollard nodded. He was already writing in his notebook, the 47-page notebook he had been keeping for 15 years. "Darius, son, go warm down. Come find me in my office in 20 minutes. We are going to figure out what your life looks like for the next 3 years." Darius nodded. He turned. He jogged slowly down the track. He did not look back at the coach, who had laughed at his shoes. He looked instead at the sky over Tatum County, which was streaked with a kind of late-afternoon orange that his father had once told him was the best light in the world to run in. He thought about Marcus Coleman. He thought about Piedmont Park. He kept running. Within 48 hours, the time was unofficially confirmed by a Class A regional steward who had been called to Tatum County to verify the timing equipment. Within a week, Darius Coleman's name had appeared in a small item in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution under the headline, "Georgia Teen Breaks, 40-Year State Recording Practice." Within a month, the Tatum County track team had been visited at practice by head track coaches from Georgia, Auburn, and on a quiet Thursday afternoon in April, a 62-year-old man with 2 NCAA championship rings on his right hand and a 1988 Olympic team jacket folded carefully on the passenger seat of his rental car. Vinnie Talbot had driven up from Decatur because he had read the article in the AJC and because he had wanted to meet the boy who had just broken the record he had set when he was 18 years old. He stood at the side of the track and watched Darius run a casual workout. He shook Darius's hand for a long time. He pulled an old pair of his own track spikes out of the trunk of his rental car, his second pair training shoes from his sophomore year at LSU, and gave them to Darius. He said, "Son, you are something else." Darius did not at first know why those words made him sit down on the infield grass and put his face in his hands. He had not heard those words from anyone since his father had died. By the end of the season, Darius Coleman had run 45.78 at the state meet in Atlanta, winning the Class A 400-meter state championship by 3.4 seconds, the largest margin of victory in the event in state history. He was named the Georgia Class A Track Athlete of the Year as a freshman. By the end of his junior year, he was running 44.83 and had received scholarship offers from 23 Division I programs. He committed to LSU on a Sunday afternoon in October of his senior year in a small ceremony in the fieldhouse at Tatum County High School. Vinnie Talbot flew in from Decatur to attend. So did Coach Mike Davies from the Atlanta Striders. So did Latrice Coleman in a navy blue dress she had bought at a department store the previous week, and Bernadine Coleman in her Sunday best hat. Marcus Coleman, who would have wanted more than anything in his life to see this moment, was represented by a small framed photograph that Darius had placed on the podium beside the LSU hat. In the photograph, Marcus was bent over the stopwatch on his phone, timing a 5-year-old Darius at Piedmont Park. Coach Reggie Mallard sat in the front row of folding chairs at the ceremony, beside his wife of 28 years. He had retired from coaching at the end of the previous season after his 33rd year. He had spent the previous summer in a quiet, halting series of conversations with Dennis Pollard, with a black retired teacher named Mrs. Hattie Brooks, who had taught at the high school for 41 years, and with a journalist from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution who had been working on a longer piece about the Tatum County program and the 17 black athletes who had passed through it over 3 decades. The article had been published the previous spring. It had not been kind to Coach Mallard. It had also, at his own request, included quotes from him acknowledging much of what the article alleged. He had, at his own initiative, sent letters of apology to 14 of the 17 former black athletes, whose names Dennis Pollard had compiled in his notebook. He had heard back from 6. 2 had accepted his apology. 2 had declined. 2 had written him letters that he kept in a drawer in his bedroom and read on the bad nights. The Confederate flag decal had been removed from the back window of his F-250 on a Sunday morning in June by his own hand in his own driveway with a single-edged razor blade and a bucket of warm soapy water. He sat in the front row of the ceremony and he did not speak. He had not been asked to speak. He had been invited as a guest, and as a guest he sat and he watched. When Darius Coleman put on the LSU hat for the photographs, Coach Mallard stood up with the rest of the room and he applauded. He did not stop applauding until Darius was hugged by his mother and his grandmother and led off the podium. Then he sat back down. He looked at his hands. 4 years later, Darius Coleman represented the United States in the 4x 400-meter relay at the Paris Olympics. He ran the third leg. The American team won silver. After the race, walking toward the press section with a medal around his neck, Darius was asked by a reporter from NBC who had been the most important coach in his career. He answered without hesitation, "My father, Marcus Coleman." The reporter, who knew the story, nodded and said nothing for a long moment. Then she asked him gently whether there was anyone else. Darius thought for a moment. He said, "There was a coach in high school. He laughed at my shoes the first day I tried out. Then he watched me run. And then he spent the rest of his career being a different man. I think about him sometimes. I hope he's doing all right." Coach Reggie Mallard, 66 years old, sitting in his living room in Hatcher, Georgia, watching the race on a television his son had bought him for Christmas, heard those words in a 4-second delay through the broadcast. He sat very still. His wife, sitting beside him on the couch, took his hand. Outside the window of the small house where he had lived for 38 years, the Georgia evening was warm and full of cicadas. Somewhere, 8,000 miles away, a black boy from Tatum County High School had just become an Olympic medalist. Coach Mallard wiped his eyes with the back of his other hand. He did not cry. He simply, quietly sat with his wife and watched the rest of the broadcast. The boy ran beautifully. The boy had always run beautifully. The boy was something else.